Malaysia, and they say how quickly it is. Now, this is contrasting Tobias's presentation on the EU. How quickly you can get an investment application approved. It can be in a matter of months. There are one-stop agencies that bring everything together, and companies have, told us that this is actually fantastic. Of course, this is coming on the back of a very strong semiconductor back-end industry. Maybe I should have said that earlier. That has been there for a long time, and there is a bit of a local supply base as well to help it. There's been some grants since the 2000s, nothing like the amounts we would see in the global north. And I think it's also important to point out that Penang, which is a state in Malaysia that has the largest amount of electronics firms and semiconductor companies, it's pretty much the major hub, is basically has the only tool as allocating land. So they get investment applications and they decide if they allow for a company to set up their factory in a free trade zone. And in recent years, this has become a choosy policy, if you will, where they want to make sure that there's more knowledge-based work, more technologically advanced operations, more automation. So as I'm not an industrial policy researcher, perhaps this comes into the mix of how we want to define a constrained type of policy environment. So what does the semiconductor industry look like in Malaysia? So this is super important because it's actually quite substantial. 20% of semiconductors out of Malaysia are exported into the US. It is actually the top supplier of chips into the US, and this is because Malaysia hosts a lot of this back end, the assembly and test. This is the last thing that happens before a chip can actually be inserted into a final product. It's the sixth largest exporter worldwide. 13% of all global back end is actually located in Malaysia. And I think the most important story to take from all of this is that since COVID-19, and in the next slide I'm going to talk about COVID-19 and the US-China trade tensions, is the massive amount of investments that many companies have announced and are following through to increase their capacity in Malaysia. So Intel, Nexperia, you can see all of this on your own. And what's kind of interesting here is that this slide, which I've stole from the Malaysian, from somewhere in, the Malaysian Investment Development Agency, is that there are some local firms, but I think they've actually made them a bit bigger to look like there's a lot. There actually isn't. In the wafer fab, Silterra has been bought by a Chinese company, so it's no longer local. But this is the context that we're facing now, is that it is dominated by multinational corporations, obviously. So here is the interesting story, a bit of preliminary analysis. I'm just presenting kind of a bit of empirics. Is that Malaysia has always been a strong China plus one strategy. Hopefully I don't need to explain that too much, but for many, many years, and the government knows it, and lots of companies locate there because of this kind of neutral, safe haven location. In some of our interviews over the summer, companies were telling us that Malaysia is the Switzerland when it comes to how it's being perceived as a safe location as part of supply chain resilience. And the Malaysian government knows this. It has passed at least a couple of policies that we've heard of that is trying to attract companies out of China or who are considering China but have their end markets in the US and the EU to come to Malaysia instead. And some examples of this is AT&S, Bosch, and ASNE. We also heard from companies that they're being told by their customers to no longer be in China or leave China or just be prepared in case the US protections get stronger. So add to that the automotive chip shortage during COVID-19, which has been traced to some Penang factory closures. I think it's ST Micro. I'd have to go in and look at this a little bit more. Really kind of woke up the industry itself, but also government, to do something about it. So what's happened for the very first time is that the Malaysian government has passed a strategy specifically for the semiconductor industry. It's called the National Semiconductor Strategy, which was announced in a haphazard way in May on the back of, I think, a regional semiconductor event. And this plan was put together very quickly with an advisory board of 10 companies, half of them local, half of them foreign. I think it's half and half. And the areas that they've picked up on to focus on is advanced packaging, so it's really interesting to hear Hassan talk about that as well, IC design and manufacturing equipment. And one of the points that was made was that this is not a protectionist policy. The Malaysian government really wants to distinguish itself from doing what the US and the EU is doing, which in their eyes is a protectionist move. It's just the reality of what developing countries are facing. And perhaps a couple of other points is to just say that for the first time, grants are being prioritized for front end and sort of foregoing the back end. And if there are tax incentives, which is their major policy tool still, being provided for the back end, it's going to be dependent on new technologies. Investment applications and grant applications are also bringing in, some of the kind of, regular things, such as making sure that these new investments are moving up the skills ladder, that there are higher salaries. There are some questions around whether this actually matches skills and salaries, or if it's just, it looks like higher skills on paper, but actually the work is still very much not high skilled. Making sure that there's university internships, local vendor programs. So I have 2 minutes left, and I'm going to end in this slide to really just kind of prompt some questions. It's a little bit preliminary, but to just kind of ask questions, as I'm not an industrial policy expert, like, what is it for? Why do we talk about it? Is it only, and now I'm kind of going backwards on my slide, but is it only about developing the industry, or is there more? And I think what complicates, for me, this question is, where do you get your industrial policy advice from? If it is from firms, and the most expert firms in the country are foreign firms, what are their objectives behind the advice? So we talked to several people who were on these advisory boards, and they were very proud of being able to tell the Malaysian government what to do. I don't know if this is a red flag. I think it is, but you're all the experts here. So, and I think also I've just put this very generic sort of global value chain map. Lots of things are missing from there. But just to think about what does this current context where the industry is restructuring, states are coming back in a very big way. We have the trade tensions. What can Malaysia get out of this? Obviously, the China +1 strategy, but also to be a bit more savvy in understanding how a value chain actually functions. So these arrows are very important. And I've drawn this kind of artificial red line. So below that red line is where Malaysia is placed. Of course, there are some front-end factories. I've shown that in that slide previously. But to maybe make the point that there is research that shows tier ones, and in this case, it is the semiconductor front ends, can be very strong players in shaping global value chains. It's not always just the lead firm or the final customer firm. So tier ones can shape their suppliers by cooperating with them, having certain types of demands, which can lead to consolidations in lower tiers, perhaps even more innovation. And this could be a good way to think about, like, where do you want as a government to steer this process now and into the future. And this could be the chance for the Malaysian government, for example, to be more proactive as opposed to continuing on this legacy of appeasement for foreign firms to enter, because they are entering Malaysia without very much work. Exactly, and then just maybe a couple of points to raise about this difficulty of local firms upgrading. One area that always gets talked about is regional value chains, and whether not competing with the foreign firms to the end markets of the EU and the US, there might actually be a better opportunity to compete for markets in the region. Okay, I'll stop at that. Thank you.